All right, so we are on chapter 14, verse 21. We were in the middle of that, and we're up to the Rashis in chapter 14, verse 21. We're in the middle. It says, Lo tagashel gedi, you know how to cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Rashi says, Sholish pamim, this is said 3 times. Prat l'chaya ofos u'behema tameah. 3 times. One is to exclude a wild animal, one is to exclude fowl, and one is to exclude a non-kosher animal. So one is to exclude a wild animal, non-kosher animal, and a bird, meaning to say that there is no prohibition in cooking meat and milk by a chaya, oaf, and behema. Those are all behema tameh. Those are all rabbinic. Okay. I don't know. We're in the Aser Ta'aser, chapter 14, verse 22. Aser Ta'aser, which is the reading for Yontif. So the pasuk says, "Aser ta'aser is called tuas zarecha. Tithe ye shall tithe all the crops." Aser ta'aser is called tuas zarecha. Tithe ye shall tithe. Thera, we're studying in memory of Thera's mother, Malka Bas Yaakov Ephreda. So it's a big honor for us to study. And do you want to say anything about your mother, Thera?
How do you start? She's just somebody that she was a very dedicated person, very caring, very kind, very gentle, but she was a fighter. And when she was, this family story, when she was a kid, she was the middle child, of 1 of 5. And her baby sister was being picked on by a bully.
What'd she do?
So she jumped up. She had to jump to hit the guy and punch the guy in the nose and give him bloody nose.
Violence?
And then later, fast forward, when they were fighting for Israel to be recognized, and there was a lot of controversy in the Jewish community because she was an early Zionist, she'd stand on street corners in New York and argue with people with their signs about, support Israel. So it's Adele.
Okay, so they're up to the verse that says, Aser ta'aser is called tuas zarecha. Tithe ye shall tithe all the crops of your field, of your planting. That comes out in the year, every single year. So Rashi says, what's the connection? Yeah, Rashi says, what's the connection between do not cook a kid in its mother's milk and tithe ye shall tithe? What's the connection? God says to the Jewish people, he says, don't cause me to cook the tender young of their crop while they're still in their mother's inside. Meaning to say, don't make me ruin your produce. If you don't take tithes properly, when the crop is about to ripen, we'll bring out the eastern wind, and that will destroy them, as it states, and it becomes blighted before it ripens. So Rashi says, now why does it say the verse, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk before the prohibition of tithing? To tell you that if you don't tithe, God is going to cook the quote-unquote kid in its quote-unquote mother's milk, meaning he'll ruin the grain before it blossoms. You can't pay the tithe from 1 year on the next year. You have to pay it 1 year at a time. Verse 23. "V'achalta lifnei Hashem Elokecha," and you shall eat before Hashem your God, v'makom asher yivchar, in the place that you will choose, l'shakein shemo sham, to dwell there. Meaning to say you have to eat this food before Hashem. Ma'asar digancha tiroshav yitzarecha, the grain, the tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil, the charot, the firstborn animal of your cattle and your flock. So you learn to fear Hashem your God all the days. Rashi says, "V'achalta." Hello, Sasson. So, v'achalta, this refers to Meiser Sheni. This refers to the secondary tithe. Shekvar lamanu v'tein Meiser Rishon Levim, because the secondary tithe is the tithe after you give the tithe to the Levites. Then you take what's called a secondary tithe. Now, this tithe has to be in Jerusalem. As it states, Ki tikumei b'nei Yisrael. But the Levites tithe, the tithe you give to the Levites, they don't have to eat it in Jerusalem, they can eat it everywhere. As it says, therefore, this is not the Levites tithe, this is a different tithe. This is the tithe that's called the Meiser Sheni. So let's go over the tithe so everybody's aware of the tithes. You start by giving the Truma. What is that? That's a percentage that you give to the Kohen. Biblically speaking, even a small amount, but rabbinically, either 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th. Then after you give Truma, you give the Meiser, you give a 10% to the Levites. But the Levite then has to give Trumas Meiser. Now, after you give the Truma and the Meiser, there's another tithe. We break everything up into a 6-year cycle, and the 7th year is a sabbatical year. You don't tithe in the sabbatical year. But in the 6-year cycle, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years, you have what's called a secondary tithe, called the Meiser Sheni. That is, you take those crops up to Jerusalem to eat them. And in the 3rd and 6th year, you give it Meiser Ani, the tithe to the poor. The Meiser Sheni, if it's too much to bring it up to Jerusalem, then you can redeem it onto money and then bring it up. Okay.
I have a calculation question.
Yes.
When you're taking these percentages, do you take it initially off the top, or do you then take the residual after giving?
Residual.
Okay.
I know you got the finance mind there, Thera. She can retire from the finance, but the finance won't retire from her.
I gotta be ready for the Mashiach, so I know the give time.
No, I mean, this is like your mortgages you're figuring out, right? So, okay, fine. Next verse. So you could redeem the tithe onto money. And you could wrap up the money in your hand. Oh, Jeffrey. All right, yeah, because we start this week at 6:05, just so you know. We're going to get a little earlier. Welcome back from Chautauqua. Was it a very beautiful spiritual experience?
Well, there's a Chabad house.
Yeah, and they have 2 weeks of spiritual inspiration.
Yeah, every day I studied Chautauqua. That was wonderful. And the teacher's great grandfather was the teacher of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Right?
Here's the Chumash you can get from over there. Yeah, we're in chapter 14, verse 25. So you take the produce and you can redeem it onto money, and then you wrap the money in your hand. When you go to the place that God has selected. So, verse 20. If the food is too much for you to carry, you could redeem it onto your money. And you shall place the money in whatever your heart desires. The cattle, the sheep, the wine, and the alcohol. Whatever your soul desires. You shall eat them there before Hashem your God. And then you shall rejoice, you and your household. So you could use the money to buy whatever you want. Rashi says, klal, but wait, doesn't mean anything. That's a general rule. And then it says, Rabakar Batson Bayanu Bashechar. That's a prat, that's a specific. You could use it for cattle or flock or wine or hard drink. And then anything your heart desires, that's another general rule. So this is a principle we have throughout the Talmud. Whenever you have what's called a klal, uprat, uklal, a general concept in the verse followed by a specific, followed by a general. Ma prat, so it means to say klal prat uklal, klal prat uklal. So what does that mean? So therefore, this is another general statement. And this is one of the 13 midos we say every morning. And this is one of the 13. So what do we do with it? Ma prat neforash vlad vladota aretz v'ra'oi l'macho adam v'kula. So it means to say that just like the specific is something that is born and something born from the earth, so too, and are fit to be food for people. Meaning to say the cattle, the flocks, and the grapevines were all created from the earth as opposed to fish, which were created from water. So it has to be something, you have to spend your money on something that was created from the earth. But I guess not fish. Rashi then, the next verse says, verse 27, Va'alevi asher b'sharecha lo tazvenu. And the Levite who's in your gates, you shall not abandon, ki en lo chelek v'nachla imach, because he has no portion and inheritance with you. Rashi says, Yatsu leket shicha peah v'hefker. This comes to exclude leket shicha peah and hefker. So it says, Va'levi, Asher b'sharecha lo tazvenu. The Levite is in your gates, you shall not abandon. Rashi says, Milutein lo ma'aser rishon. You have to give the Levite the first tithe. Ki en lo chelek v'nachla imach, because the Levite has no portion with you. This exclude leket shicha peah v'hefker. He does have a portion in the gleanings and the forgotten quarters of the field. Kamocha, just like you do. But those parts, the charity basically that you leave behind, they don't need to be tithed. Now the next Rashi, the next verse says, at the end of 3 years, at the end of 3 years, you have to get rid of all of the tithes of your grain that year and place it in your gates. Rashi says, Bagui made Shem Hisha Masro Sav, Shal Shana Rishono, Shnia Shmita, Sheyavirem Minabayas Baslishi. That let's say he delayed giving his tithes in the first and second years, meaning to say he kept them around the house. He didn't give them, that by the third year he has to destroy them. He can't leave them around.
So at the end of every 3 years, that starts with after the Shemitah.
Yeah, you have to get rid of all the, if you're supposed to have given your tithes. But if you didn't give your tithes, you have to get rid of it. Verse 29. And then the Levite shall come if he has no portion or inheritance with you. And the ger, the yatom and the almanah who's in your gates, the resident, the orphan, the widow who's in your gates, and they'll eat and they'll be satisfied. So that Hashem will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. She says, the Levite comes and takes the first tithe. And the Levite comes and takes the first portion. And the stranger and the orphan and the widow who's in your gates, they take the Meiser Sheni. Shehu Sha'ani Shal Shanazu. This here belongs to the poor person. And you should not eat it in Jerusalem. This is what we said before. You eat the first tithe, and the secondary tithe has to be in Jerusalem, but the tithe for the poor, that can be in anywhere. And they'll eat and be satisfied. How much do you have to give to the poor person in order to fulfill the mitzvah? You have to give him enough so that he's satisfied. From here we learn that we do not give less to a poor person at the threshing floor than a half a cup of wheat or a cup of barley, because that's the amount that's necessary to be satisfied. I guess this is relevant. So you see a poor man on the street, how much do you want to give him? You have to give him enough to be satisfied. But the tithe of the first and the second year, you do take that to Jerusalem. And you confess. You're going to say that later on. You say, I got rid of it from my house, first, but so this is like what I said before, that the first and second and fourth and fifth years, you give the secondary tithe after you give the tithes to the Kohen and the Levites, but in the third and the sixth year, you give the tithe to the poor. That's called Meiser Ani. Okay, now we're on chapter 15. The end of 7 years, you have to do Shemitah, release. Rashi says, Yachol Sheva Shanim L'Kol Milva U'Milveh. I might think, here, you can just, okay, just tell her we'll call her back after. Tell her we're in a
I'll
class.
call you back in a few minutes.
No, later.
Okay, good job. So then it says, at the end of 7 years, the loans are released. Now you might think that this is 7 years for each and every loan, but no, Rashi says, Talmud Omar, Karva Shnat Hasheva, that it's at the end of the 7th year. Im Afa Amatal Omar, meaning to say that as the 7th year comes, don't refrain from giving a loan. The Imata Omer Sheva Shanim L'Kol Melva, and if you say that there's 7 years for each and every loan, then there's no such thing because you always have 7 years. Rashi's telling us, don't think for a second that the 7 years means. Don't think for a second that it means that there's just for each loan you get 7 years. You're actually saying no, that there's a period, which is the period of the sabbatical year, and the loans will be released when the end of the sabbatical year comes. So then the verse tells us, and that's what we had this past year. And this is the law of the sabbatical year. Every creditor shall release his authority over what he lent to his friend. He should not press upon his friend and his brother. Because he's proclaimed a Shemitah year to God. Rashi says, Shamot kol ba'al ma'aseh yado, Shamot es yado, so kol ba'al ma'aseh. Release the authority of every creditor. You shall release your authority. Okay, next verse. So you're not allowed to oppress your fellow friend. Esa nachriti goes. This is again not the most ecumenical part of the Torah, but it says the non-Jew you must oppress. But over that which you have your brother, you release your authority. Meaning to say, as it relates here, Harold, we have an extra chumash right here. So as it relates to your fellow Jew, you're not allowed to oppress them. Release them at the sabbatical year. But as it relates to your brother, release your hand. Release your hand. Hold on, let me just since Okay,
Tigos means oppress,
yes, well,
not
you,
demand.
no, it's a press.
The Seinfeld translates it as demand, which is less offensive than oppress.
Okay, maybe press means press.
Press somebody for it to,
Yeah.
like, yeah, okay.
That's the way.
You know what I learned? Seth reminded me that it was Rabbi Scheinfeld's yard set on Friday. So we studied in his memory. He gives us so much every day, even after his body has left the world. Yeah, but so Rashi says it's a nachriti goes, you oppress the non-Jew. Zo mitzvah say. This is a positive commandment. It's a positive commandment to oppress the non-Jew. What does that mean? First of all, we have to note that many editions, the censors remove this, or maybe self-censorship. Remove this. The idea that we're at chapter 15 of the book of Devarim, Carol. So we have to remove this. Many people remove this. But what does it mean it's a positive commandment? So the Ramban says it doesn't mean that it's a positive commandment to press the non-Jews to repay their money. It means to say that it's a negative commandment to force a Jew. And that's what it's saying, meaning to say by not forcing the Jew, you're fulfilling a positive commandment. That's what Nachmanides says. It seems a little apologetics, but because it's not exactly what Rashi says. By the way, it's time to celebrate a miracle. We should say, because I got a letter from the DC government saying that on August 2nd, the Office of Records of Tax and Revenue says that our property has no outstanding District of Columbia tax liability.
You get one of those.
Yeah.
They're not pressing the Jews.
Yeah, right.
They pressed plenty.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I think oppressed means when they don't have the money. But I know personally, I'm not saying it's me, where people lent money, they have the money, just won't give it up. It's a 3-month loan, it's 9 years already. And they have the money. What does one do?
Wait 1 second. You lent money to somebody for 3 months, and now it's a 9-year loan.
Right. And they have the money.
I
So
mean,
Should you oppress them and call them once a month and see
yeah,
what
well,
happens?
no, you're exactly right. No. The Torah says not to press when you lent it in the sabbatical year, but already, the Hillel instituted a prusbul and said that as long as you do a prusbul, you can press upon the person you lent the money to pay you back. So did you do a prusbul this year?
Yep. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So you could call them up and press the money and try to collect it. How much are we talking about?
You don't want to know.
Last year, no?
No, he did a prusbul before the sabbatical year. He said 9
Yeah, which
years
was
is
last
going
year.
on. What?
Which was last year.
Yeah, I know, but he did it then. No,
Right.
he did the prusbul at the beginning of this year,
Yes.
8 months ago.
Right.
We did it at the end of the Shemitah year, before Rosh Hashanah. Yeah,
Right,
so,
correct.
okay, so then, what do you want from me, Judah? I'm on your side.
No, I'm saying, but you can't oppress. You
You
can't give a
can try
blanket
to
don't
get your
oppress.
money back if this was before Hillel instituted the prusbul. But before Hillel instituted the prusbul, then there was a negative commandment to try and collect the money. But then Hillel saw that it wasn't working like that. And then Hillel set up a prusbul that you could do that and then press your money. And part of the reason is because he saw people weren't lending money. But the other reason is today we know that when you lend money, most of the time you're lending money, it's not just for a person to get food off the street because he can't have bread on his table. It's because he's going to take that money and he's going to invest it. If you buy a treasury bill today, you're getting 5.4% annually. So So why should I give him money when he goes and invests it in the treasury bills and he's getting 5.4%? And then you're actually losing money by lending the money. It's not like money's a commodity today. Harold, would you agree with that? So basically, you're losing money by lending the money at no cost. There you go. Julie. If you want me to call with you, I'm happy to. All right.
No. You're good. You're good. You know, that's a pretty good answer. You should be a rabbi.
My friends, Dr. Judah Shore. Dr. Judah Shore. Ladies and gentlemen. All right. However, there shall be no destitute amongst you. So God says, even though you have to give money to the poor, but guess what? There's not going to be any poor amongst you. So don't worry about that. Because Hashem will bless you in the land that Hashem, your God, gave to you as an inheritance. Verse 4. But later on it states, but there will never stop being poor people. So what is it? When you do the will of God, then the poor people are amongst others, and not amongst you. When you don't do the will of God, then the destitute are amongst you. Okay.
There's a difference between poor and somebody who always feels poor, even if he has $1 million in the bank.
Well, that's something else.
I think that's what Evion is. Evion is somebody who Evion is because he will never ever be satisfied with what he has.
Very nice.
And we are not obligated to help such a person because he has the money, right? The Gemara gives exactly what the parameters are for tzedakah and
very nice. Very nice. Rabbi Yosef, I say what Judah said. You should be a rabbi. Okay, so now the verse states, Evyon dal meyani, but Evyon is someone who's poorer than a poor man, poorer than an Evyon. What's shown Evyon shu ta'eva kol davar. This is what Rabbi Yosef says. He longs for everything, but Rashi is not taking the same approach as Rabbi Yosef. Rashi is saying that there's poor, and then there's an ani, and then there's an Evyon. The Evyon is even less than the ani. Actually, the Midrash to Vayikra Rabbah lists Evyon as one of, guess how many names the Torah has for a poor person? Guess how many names there are for a poor person in the Torah? The Midrash says 8. 8. I'm trying to think offhand how many I could think of. There's Ani. What? No, Ani, Evyon. Avanim.
Yeah, that's an afflicted person.
We'll have to look that up. I'll see the context. I'm sure you're right, but let me see the context. Okay, so we'll check that.
in Parashat Behar we have Mach.
Mach, we have Dal, we have
Dal.
Rash,
Wow.
we have Adins, what Adin mentioned.
Yes, that's already 6.
Okay, I'm sure the other ones, when we see them, we'll be like, oh, icon, Family Feud. Oh, we knew that one. Okay, one more verse. We have time for, actually, we should stop here to have a mincha. All righty, yeah, Shakor.
I want to say a quick thing.
Yes.
About wealth. Ready? And it also could be poor. There's a guy who's so poor that all he has is money. You have to think about that.
Well, I'm here with my father. My father always says money isn't everything. Health is 2%. I know.
On that note, we're going to daven.
We're going